I went down to London at 18 to sort of study theatre, broadly speaking. And at that point, I had no concept of anything really more than an actor, a director, and stage manager. And video design sort of wasn't really a discipline then. I did various things at university, like directing, acting. I didn't do acting, sorry. I did directing, producing, and dramaturgy. And I found directing wasn't for me. And then the other two things took me too much out of like the room where the show was being made, which is the bit that I really enjoyed was, being with other people, kind of all throwing ideas into the pot and sort of seeing what comes out the other end. And I left university. I did a lot of work in lighting for a while. Um, and then it was just about that point in 2003 where the sort of video was starting to become more of a thing and the technology was evolving. And there was a lot of crossover between sort of lighting control systems and video control systems. So I it was kind of quite logical to kind of just drift from one into the other. And I kind of started playing around in the world of video and I was like, oh, this is really interesting. Like I could see how it had a long way to go, but it was going to develop and form into something really interesting. And no, I don't mean this as like any kind of disrespect to lighting, but like the tools of lighting have fundamentally remained the same for the past 20 years, whereas the tools and the capacity with which we have to deliver sort of video and the live experience has, dramatically changed in the past 20 years and continues to do so. So kind of moving into the technical side of things is where I began. And then that kind of slowly led into the more creative side of things, assisting other designers, and then to eventually doing like my own work. And, 15 years later, here we are. I think you need a connection to the story that's being told on stage in order to make video have agency in the show and in the telling of it. It has to be, for me, for it to work and to be interesting, if you took away the video, you'd miss part of the story. If that makes sense. So it has to be kind of bound into the fabric of the show. And almost like the presence of another actor or another character in the piece. So it can have its own voice and opinion. Sometimes that can be quite indirect, sometimes that can be very explicit. And I think particularly when it's used to explore the inner world of characters and bring out something that kind of lives inside their head that we can't maybe see or we can't understand, but to kind of render it in the world around them for the audience to kind of go, oh, that's what's happening, oh, that's how they're feeling, oh, that's where we're going. I think that's a really exciting thing to be able to do. If it's just clouds and fire, it's not very exciting, but when you're kind of unpicking someone's inner world, then it's very exciting. I think I always like when I'm designing a show, I like to keep the audience like in the forefront of my mind. So it's maybe not so much about the venue or the size of the venue even. I mean, an interesting example now is we're doing a music about the life of the televangelist Tammy Faye Baker, which started in London in a tiny little theatre, but a very prestigious one, and now is moving to open basically it's not a new theatre in New York, but it's an extensively refurbished theatre in New York. And both of those things are incredible privileges, but I think they're not going to work if we don't kind of get Tammy's story front and center. So, and it's sort of it's thinking about what the audience is expecting from the show, and there's certain things you have to give them, I think, but that doesn't mean you have to kind of feed them or pander to them. You've got to treat them with intelligence and respect, but you have to make I feel I have to make the show for them, as well as for me. So I tend to do things I would want to see, if that makes sense. So, I would say the weight of the venue and the expectations is something that I am absolutely aware of, but I try not to let it become the thing that I am working towards. It's the audience who's going to come into that venue that I'm sort of working to lift, distract, divert, educate, entertain, show a sort of different side of something too. I've been very lucky that I've certainly the shows that have gone in the West End have always had an interesting life to them. Like Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime is one of the first shows I did that sort of just went all over the world and um, gained a really enthusiastic and committed following. And that had a really interesting journey because we started it at the National Theatre in London. Completely in the round with just projection on the floor because there was nothing, there was just audience everywhere. And then when we moved it into a venue in the West End, we had to transform how the show worked, which became the show that everyone knows and remembers now. And that was a real challenge and an interesting thing to do. And then for various complicated reasons we had to move to a different theatre in the West End, and then we went to New York, then we went on tour, and then it went all over China, which is incredible. So that show, for just the reach and the touch it's had to people, is really, and also the collaboration with everyone who made that show was really exciting as well. So that was a really beautiful piece. And another show that stands out, that we had a very happy time making and continues to run in the West End, is Back to the Future, the musical, which is just, it's a pleasure to watch the audience watching that show because they come so ready to have a really good time. And I do feel we give them that good time, from like the diehard fan who knows everything about every movie and every Easter egg, like they get rewarded and sort of given what they want. And then to the person who's never heard the story before has a wonderful time. And as a team of people making that show, it was also very rewarding and exciting to create that. And I suppose one other one that comes to mind is Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, which are still running in the West End. And it's the first time. I won't say too much about what the video does in that show because it's magic and I don't want to give it away. But the first time, the moment the video runs in the show, there's like an audible gasp from the audience, and I still remember that the first time, just going, okay, this is going to work. And it's wonderful that that is still running now. Bringing Back to the Future from the West End to Broadway, the thing I was nervous about was had we kind of got the world of America on stage correct, because we are an entirely British design team. We're representing some very American experiences, albeit we have an American writer and American director to sort of bring that authenticity. But we have to sell that to a US audience who have to believe it because it's their culture, their history on stage. And that was something I was sort of slightly nervous about. But I think because we were very faithful to the original film and a lot of the detail in the original film, that world naturally arrived through sort of layering all that work and detail into it. It's also a very different space. London's very square space, whereas the US, the theatre here in New York, which I can almost see out my window now, is much wider, but lower. So it actually took on a much more cinematic aspect here in New York, which was actually quite rewarding for a show that has some incredibly filmic sequences in it as well. So that was quite exciting. And it continues to run successfully here to this day. So I think we got it right. The balance between performer and the screens or the projection or the video around them is a really important thing to consider when you're putting together a show, because ultimately people haven't come to see your content. They could, people go to the cinema to sort of have that kind of experience. They have come to fundamentally experience something live and also share that with other people. So I think when it's anything like a music show or a theatre show, we're having to consider the relationship and the energy of that moment. So sometimes there are times where we can go really big, maybe like in an instrumental passage and in some music where it's less about the singer. But then when we kind of come back to vocal, then we have to pull everything back down to them. So, we have to think about how we can kind of shift in scale and how the scale of that human on the stage can relate. So, Coldplay is such a huge production, that a large part of what we do is about kind of connecting Chris and the performers on the stage to the people in the audience through the screens. Whereas the Lewis Capaldi show you mentioned, that was more of an arena scale. So it was more about sort of framing him in a space that had a sort of an emotional temperature to it that was suitable for the song that he was singing. So, the tone of everything matched the tone of the music and kind of brought our eye naturally to him, because he's quite a sort of static performer. He doesn't run all over the place. So I think it's just about considering every moment in terms of performer, scale, presence, focus. And if you do that, you usually get it right. It's different. A theatre thing, you're often trying to create a very coherent line from A to B. Whereas a pop show, you may be working within a concept that is, this show is going to be, for example, retro spaceship, kind of broken TV signal flying through space, getting lost more and more and more lost. But within that kind of idea, you often have to come up with like 22 ideas to match 22 songs. Um, you know, and sometimes those are about video being really in the foreground, maybe if it's a very sort of narrative song. And sometimes that's just about kind of pushing into the background and letting like lasers come forward or have a big lighting number. Or sometimes it's about really bringing the performer to the audience through using kind of cameras and effects that sort of get into the energy and the subtext of a song. And it's not like there's a sort of written list of instructions as to how to find those moments. Like sometimes you need to just listen to things a lot, and it'll sort of, it's like a synesthesia. The eventually sort of images start to flow, and sometimes they're very immediate or sometimes they're really not. And sometimes you actually go down one path and it's completely wrong, and you have to throw a week of work away and kind of go, okay, well, we've learned that's a bad idea. So what's the good idea? Or, you have to radically simplify something. Or so it's a really different thing, because also the relationship with the performer is different to the theatre performer as well. Maybe in music, I think you can be a bit more foregroundy than you can, whereas theatre often you're a bit more background. So it's they're like two, you're using the same tools and the same technique, but the actual thought process for both of them is quite different. I think it's usually an act of collaboration with, like myself, director, set designer, lighting designer, all looking at the new show, the new idea. And I think often, like, I like to start almost like at the end, or start with like the biggest number in the show, which is usually like the end of act one, and then maybe the number that's 10 minutes, 10, 20 minutes before the end of act two, which are like the big showstoppers that the audience has to take that memory away. And it's almost like you kind of build your design and your space around those. So you put like a lot more effort and thought into them, and then the rest of the show sort of flows from there. And I think that kind of focus on delivering the wow moment, the ooh, uh, can't be done like quickly. It has to be sort of slow, and it has to be layered, and then you add complexity over time. And that leads to, a new idea, a kind of an effect, a a surprising way to kind of turn the story around. And technology is always shifting and always moving along, and it almost becomes a natural part of the job is keeping up with it. And I feel like one thing I've really noticed in the past 5 years is, as much as video technology is the one that people always cite as going, oh, it's can do all these crazy new things now. It's also the technology by which you can like physically animate the space of the stage, like how automation can move scenery and things around has really, really developed and got so much kind of layering and subtlety to it now that kind of creates a really interesting relationship to video as well, because you can transform the texture, the shape, and the feeling of the space, but then the space can also physically shift itself. And then if you play with those two things together, you start to find something quite interesting. I look for rules. I think I find kind of help govern a process. So, but without being restrictive. So it's contradictory. But when you start looking at a show, you start looking at maybe the things that video can do that are useful to it. And that might be delivering a joke or telling the audience just quite simply where we are, or bringing out little subtle details or going inside the character's head. And you sort of think, well, which of these things do I need to do? And then you sort of start to form a system around how to deliver those that sort of goes, okay, this is that moment, this is this moment. How am I going to apply that here? And I suppose a good way of thinking about it is someone called Catherine Alexander, who's a very wise theatre maker, once told me that at any moment on stage, something has to be three things. It has to be literal, abstract, and poetic simultaneously, and that makes an interesting piece of theatre. So I think I'm always looking at, what is literal, like the how, who, how, where of the story, then the abstract, like how do we shift that into the theatrical language, like what's our way of presenting that, and then the poetic, which is like how do we make it beautiful. And I think those kind of the sort of system of rules that govern maybe the ideas, and then the sort of tension of those three ideas kind of connected to the story and where we're all going together, I think are how I sort of try and navigate that process. The seasonal idea came from the creative director Grant Orchard, so that was something that was sort of, I think, largely between them and management. But with that idea in mind, we did this sort of massive kind of referencing exercise of maybe 40 or 50 kind of just A4 pages of like 6 images that this could be a song in spring, this could be a song in autumn, this could be a song, not 50 pages for each season, but 50 pages for the whole thing. And it's, way more than you'd ever need, and sort of sent that off to the universe, and that sort of came back, filtered down into, I think the 22 songs that there are in the show. And that it was from those sort of then 20 pages with 6 kind of images on it is then how we then started to expand further by creating, we call them style frames. So it's basically we're not using reference images from like books or Pinterest or wherever. We're actually taking the idea and then building our own version of it and applying it to the space and seeing how that can play, to do like a verse, a chorus, and a bridge look to kind of go, this is now the evolved thing to get approval. And then when we have that approval, then we go and build the song basically and do notes on it. And we like to work in quite a kind of layered way. So rather than making something that we think is completely perfect and finished, we do like a rough first pass, share that with our collaborators, check temperature, see if this is going in the right direction. If it is, develop it more. If it's not, we haven't wasted weeks. We made a lot of use of this piece of software called Notch, which can kind of process a live camera feed in all sorts of strange and interesting ways. So what you can do is really kind of bed the camera down into the content and into the colors and the textures of each moment. So you're not just sticking an ungraded camera onto a screen while there's all this lovely content and lighting happening around you, making something that binds both worlds together. Which I think it went quite well, because the show starts off kind of quite atmospheric, quite simple with cameras, and then content then gradually builds in over the first 5 songs, and then the 5th song is content everywhere, and a little less about cameras actually by the time it gets to the end of it. So that kind of gave us our journey, and I think it's something that FRAY we've got particularly good at, is kind of bringing the camera into the main screens and into the space and making it feel almost like content in itself, albeit very kind of complicated stuff happening on the back end to mess up and play with the image in a as you would a piece of content in something like After Effects. it's not so recent, but there is the software Notch that I just mentioned that I think we make more and more and more and more use of. It's a real time sort of compositing software that you can also use to run live during a show. So that I think I find continually interesting how the traditional concert IMAG, which would be, cameras on screens out to the sides, not really very creative, is now kind of coming from way out there to much more into the center of the space. Um, and I find that quite satisfying because I think it makes the show more focused. It's more interesting for the audience to see, and it's more creative. It's not new, but it keeps getting better. I think is where I get quite pleased by it. In the end, it sort of we work with Sam Tozer a fair bit, so we sort of have a sense of where he was going to be at. We hadn't worked with Grant before, but we make big use of things like online whiteboards, where we have everything is kind of constantly updated with frames of where everything is, so people can always see what the latest idea and version is, and we kind of then just push the version 1 to the end, add in version 2, and just keep going, so the journey as well is really clear. And then it's just simple pieces of software like Frame.io, where the latest version of anything can be found and easily accessed by everyone. So it's just really two links, and that tends to sort of bind everyone together. And speaking kind of twice a week, 2, 3 times a week, depending on how things are going, rather than because I'd much prefer a lot of small conversations than one long big conversation a week, because I think it's just easier to retain detail and stuff doesn't get lost. Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime is definitely one that stands out for me, as where I think for me it was the first time I had such a big canvas to play with, and such a rich creative team to collaborate with, that we could really kind of enhance the storytelling and the audience's conception of what was happening. And video could be like really big and massive, but also not sort of destroy the space or pull from the space. It felt like it was um rewarding us, helping us understand it. And that sort of, it was a while ago now, that show, but it does stand out as where I think in my mind something clicked and changed, and I was like, this is actually quite interesting, and this is how I can approach it. And I think a lot of in that process, a lot of threads that were unconnected in my head sort of started to join together and become what the sort of foundation of what I do now. I'm interested in where real-time technologies like Notch and Unreal are going to bring us, and what that can mean for video content in the live environment, where we don't have to, quite simply crossfade from one thing to another. Animation can just evolve on cue, and how we can make stuff more integrated to how we can make videos live as the performer. Like, I think that's where I start to get excited. And I think, if we can keep pushing that and keep making that both kind of technically feasible, but also user friendly towards the creative mind, then I think that would be a really exciting evolution to happen. And it's been happening slowly for a while, and it keeps getting better. So I think we just have to keep pushing that idea.